Welcome to this London Review of Books podcast, part of a series about 20th century British American poets and their poems. My name is Seamus Perry. I teach English at the University of Oxford, and I'm speaking with Mark Ford, who is both a professor of English at University College London and also a poet. Our subject today is the British poet Stevie Smith, who has a perhaps eccentric but tenacious reputation, and we're going to be exploring both the tenacity of that reputation and also perhaps that eccentricity. And we thought that one way of beginning would be by considering her most famous single poem, Not Waving but Drowning. Nobody heard him, the dead man, but still he lay moaning. I was much further out than you thought, and not waving but drowning. Poor chap. He always loved larking, and now he's dead. It must have been too cold for him. His heart gave way, they said. Oh, no, no, no. It was too cold always. Still the dead one lay moaning. I was much too far out all my life, and not waving but drowning. So, Mark, a poem that no one else but Stevie Smith could conceivably have written. What makes it so Smithian, do you think?
I think some of the words, larking is a particularly striking word. Poor chap, he always loved larking. It's got a kind of demotic to it. It's an ordinary word, and it evokes a sense of fun, which is, in the circumstances, gruesome and poignant. It was actually based on a newspaper story that she came across of someone who was not waving but drowning. Then there was also a colleague of hers in the office where she worked who something similar had happened to him, but he survived, fortunately. But I think the rhymes are particularly striking. That Smith is a great rhymester, and her rhymes are ones which always evoke I suppose the shadow of doggerel, and the power of her poetry is when the shadow of doggerel is evoked but somehow transcended or transformed in some way to create something that's genuinely powerful, disturbing, unsettling. And in this case, it seems to me quite the idea of the poem is that this image becomes a kind of universalizing metaphor for how we all experience life, that instead of feeling in control of things or somehow signaling our joy of things, actually beneath those signals of joy or happiness is a sense of despair. And that desperation underlies, I think, all her best poetry. And this is a good instance of her finding an image for it, which completely encapsulates it. And once you've read this poem, you'll never forget it.
That's right. And for sure, part of the effect of that is that off-rhyme, moaning and drowning that she repeats. As you say, she's a fantastic rhymester, but she's perhaps an even more brilliant off-rhymester or bad rhymester on purpose, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, and the repetitions are great, aren't they? That it comes back, that there's no escape from this particular scenario, the moaning, drowning, which is in 2 and 4 of stanza 1, is again in 2 and 4 of stanza 3. And that they said has its own single line. Well, the line before goes on for a long time. It must have been too cold for him, his heart gave way, with no punctuation, which is again kind of characteristic of the way that she takes licenses that other poets don't allow themselves in terms of leaving out punctuation and so on. And often it does, I think, quite deliberately in her work, aim at, it was called faux-naif by Philip Larkin, but at a kind of the kind of poem that a schoolchild might write. And that's a deliberate effect on her part. So the sophistication is a complex one, and perhaps not that different from some of the things we talked about in relation to Elizabeth Bishop, who also makes use of faux-naif personas and voices or perspectives. But Smith makes use of them fairly relentlessly throughout her oeuvre.
And just before we move on to look at one of her earlier poems, it's also worth pausing, I suppose, to say something about the tone of the poem, because one of the things that makes Smith's work so striking is it's often tonally very difficult to pin down, isn't it? As you say, this is a poem that in some ways does things which in a different context would be funny, like trying to rhyme moaning with drowning, for example. And yet the comedy of it, the sort of the farcical elements of the poem are clearly braced against an intensely sort of tragic vision that is the subject of the poem.
I think so, and I think it's even more complex to work out how to respond when you hear her read it. She became a very famous performer of her poems in the 60s, and this was her kind of pièce de résistance for many of her shows, and she would read it in a haunting, wailing voice, and to an extent she was presenting herself as not quite the mad woman in the attic, but as someone who was deliberately performing an eccentric, and that the distinctiveness of the performance, that she wasn't was part of the difficulty of pinning down what she was doing. Was she a crazy person, or was she writing poems underpinned by a great deal of reading, a great deal of thought, and expressing a coherent and persuasive vision of life?
Yes, she resisted the label eccentric, didn't she? But I think the resistance to the label was itself part of the eccentric persona that was all wrapped up in the idea of Stevie.
Well, yes. I mean, interesting, she got her name. Do you know how she got her name?
No.
She was born Florence Margaret, but she was called Stevie after a jockey, and her hairstyle resembled that of a jockey called Steve Donahue in the 1920s, and the name stuck. But the fact that she had a name that was, well, you might say, trans, and that Stevie Smith was in some ways wasn't a typical woman of her period, to put it no more strongly than that. And it's not clear what nature her sexuality was, that she did occupy this rather sort of in-between or amorphous space between the two polarities of gender. And that may relate to her upbringing. The next poem we were going to look at was the Papa Love Baby, which talks about the fact that her father left when she was 3 and went to sea. She was born in Hull in 1902, and when she was 3, her father, who had owned a kind of coal business, went bankrupt, and he ran away to sea. And Stevie was left with her older sister, who was 2 years older, Molly, and her mother and the aunt. And the aunt, who was called Ethel Spear. No, the mother was called Ethel Spear. The aunt was called Madge Spear. They were the kind of dominant figures in Stevie Smith's life. So she grew up in an all-female household. And in this poem, Papa Love Baby, she kind of ponders how it is, what role she herself may have played in her father's sudden disappearance, though he did return later periodically, but she never really established a relationship with him. Papa Love Baby. My mother was a romantic girl, so she had to marry a man with his hair in curl, who subsequently became my unrespected papa, but that was a long time ago now. What folly it is that daughters are always supposed to be in love with papa. It wasn't the case with me. I couldn't take to him at all, but he took to me. What a sad fate to befall a child of 3. I sat upright in my baby carriage and wished mamma hadn't made such a foolish marriage. I tried to hide it, but it showed in my eyes, unfortunately. And a fortnight later, papa ran away to sea. He used to come home on leave. It was always the same. I could not grieve. But I think I was somewhat to blame.
It's a wonderfully sort of throwaway moral conclusion at the end, isn't it? Especially with the word somewhat. It's almost the opposite of a poem that Sylvia Plath would write in a way.
Well, but Sylvia Plath was a huge admirer and wrote to Stevie Smith saying that, she was one of her favourite poets. And I'm not sure this isn't in the background of Daddy, that the use of the nursery rhyme style rhymes and the rhythms, and that there's also, it's dealing with father issues, you could say.
Yes, and the lovely way in which the child is given a sort of judicious and reasoning voice. It wasn't the case with me. I couldn't take to him at all. Wonderful refusal to subscribe to any Freudian account of what the family is like.
But I'm not quite sure what she means, but he took to me. That sounds a little bit on the edge, put it no more than that. So this meant that the Smith family was effectively abandoned by the breadwinner, and it's not quite clear why, but they moved from Hull when she was 3 down to London, and they settled in Palmer's Green, famously. And in fact, I went up to Palmer's Green yesterday. I had a look at 1 Avondale Road, where Smith lived for entire life from 1906 to 1971, and she was very much associated with Palmer's Green. Have you been there?
I haven't, no, but since you've done this piece of field work for the London Review of Books, perhaps you could characterise the neighbourhood.
Well, when she moved there, it would have been quite rural. I mean, it's really quite a long way North London. I mean, I got on the 141 from Stoke Newington, and it was a good 45 minutes before I got to Palmer's Green. And even then I had to walk quite a way to get to Avondale Road. And when they moved there, it would have been right on the outskirts and in the country. It's now part of a London suburb. And in her life, she thought of it as a suburb, and she writes poems about the suburbs. She's actually a great poet of the London suburbs, and there are some of them, but not that many of them. But a poem of hers called Suburb I particularly like, and included in my anthology of the poetry of London, because unlike most poets, she does approach the suburb, and she has great affection for the suburbs. There's actually a quite late poem called Avondale, when she kind of riffs on this, what is a suburban Victorian street of no great distinction or interest. How sweet the birds of Avondale, of Avondale, of Avondale, how sweet the birds of Avondale do swoop and swing and call, and so on. And you never quite know whether she's mocking suburbia or actually relishing the pleasures of suburbia. It's kind of Rus in urbe.
So this is like a serio-comic voice, which is a little bit like Betjeman's, perhaps, in some ways.
I think so. I think that's a really interesting analogy, and that they're both, interestingly, both of them found a public, a general public, which not that many poets of the 20th century have managed to do. People who bought their books and went to see them read, and bought their books as other people buy novels, bought books of poetry as other people buy novels. So to that extent, it's certainly both Smith and Betjeman seem to have found the sweet spot of the English poetry loving public.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Series 1 of Modern-ish Poets. To listen to the full series and to all our other close reading series, sign up at lrb.me/close readings or click on the link below.